You tease this. Let's use this as a way to transition into Hassan Reddick, because if the Eagles are going to have to rebuild that position with draft picks, we need to know what is possible for them to do. So you did a good job for a story on allphly.com looking into sort of the recent history of edge rusher trades, if we want to pull that up, Julia. But this year, you've got Montez Sweat. Now some of these are in season, some of these are out of season. There's a bit of a difference, and obviously you'll talk about the age differences here. But Montez Sweat gets a second-round pick mid-season. Chase Young got, what, a third?
Third, yep.
Okay. Last year you had Bradley Chubb, who goes for a fifth and a first and a fourth from Denver to Miami. Robert Quinn for the Eagles obviously gave up a fourth-round pick. That one worked out very well. Khalil Mack going from Chicago to the Chargers for a second and a future sixth. Von Miller, you go back a second and a third. Yannick Ngakoue, a third and a fifth. Earlier that season, Yannick Ngakoue for a second and a fifth, a little bit younger. And then you go back to 2019, Jadeveon Clowney for a third. Frank Clark and two players. Frank Clark for a third and a first.
Frank Clark and a third.
Oh, Frank Clark and a third for a first, second, and third. The second was a future one, and then Robert Quinn at that point just for a sixth-round pick.
Yeah, so I agree with what you said, that you have to kind of look at the in-season and the off-season trades a little bit differently, because the context is different. A player like Von Miller, who's a pending free agent but is going to a team on the verge of winning the Super Bowl, there's a little bit of let's push the chips into the table,
right.
F the picks here, right? And then something like even the Montez Sweat trade this year, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get ahead of free agency. You're trying to get a guy who you're giving up your second-round pick so you don't have to compete with other teams on the open market, essentially. But the deal that jumps out to me is Khalil Mack, because Khalil Mack was a better overall player in his career than Reddick, but was 2 years older then,
right,
or a year and a half older, and wasn't coming off the same string of successful seasons that Reddick has had.
Off-season trade too.
Contract related, and gets a second-round pick in there. And what jumps out to me with all of these trades, there's a lot of second-round picks. So that's probably the value that you're looking at. You probably want a second plus, but now the Eagles would ask for a first, I imagine, right? When you look at the Bradley Chubb trade and the Frank Clark trade, but
I wonder if the ask would be something like a third this year and a second that can turn into a one next year.
Interesting. Oh, okay. So they can keep this string along of having like multiple picks in the first and second round. Maybe so. But if you're looking at kind of replenishing the roster for next year, then having another second round pick, having 3 second round picks, I imagine would be of interest. It would be of priority to them. So I think that a deal for Reddick would probably require at least a second round pick and more from the Eagles. And this is going to be about compensation. And the other thing to consider, so we talked about Montez Sweat, right? Montez Sweat signs a deal for $24.5 million a year. Okay, there are 11 edge rushers now making over $20 million. Hassan Reddick makes $15 million. We know the Eagles got Hassan Reddick on a below market deal. We know any trade is going to require a team to pay Hassan Reddick. Like the reason why this is on the table is he wants a new deal. So you're probably thinking in that $25 million range for Reddick. Now, if Reddick can't get the number that he's looking for, maybe there's a number that's in that 20 to 25 range that the Eagles might say, all right, how about this? We'll pay you this instead of getting the draft picks. But I think this is going to be about compensation and cap consideration. My guess, though, is he's moved and the Eagles get a second.
You would put your turkeys on that he is moved at this point?
Yes. Yeah. I don't think the Eagles are going to pay him in Sweat. And I can see from an age perspective, the Eagles keeping Sweat. I think that this was interesting. Sheil brought up on the show last week that he thinks the Eagles can get more for Sweat. You were kind of surprised by that.
I disagree with that.
I think Reddick's a better player, and so I think you can get real good compensation for Reddick. And if you can get a second and a third, like a second this year and a third next year, maybe that would be enticing. But you have to have a really strong plan because he's a special player.
And the early book, at least, and sometimes this stuff is wrong, but it does not look like a great draft class of edge rushers. Certainly not super deep. The flip side to that is it is actually a very good class of free agent edge players.
Yes.
Now, not all of those guys are going to get to free agency, and you're going to have lots of competition there. But I think there is a way that the Eagles could backfill if they need to. The Josh Sweat of it all, I'm just, and maybe it's recency bias, but he was so invisible in the second half of the season while playing all of those snaps that, like, I'm a little bit worried that we have seen the best of Josh Sweat already.
Well, look, I'm not going to push back on that. And Sweat did not finish the season well. And Reddick's track record is better than Sweat's. I think Reddick's a better player than Sweat. The Eagles tend to favor, for lack of a better term, guys they drafted, homegrown players. And
certainly on paper, you would want the guy who's three and a half years younger.
But if you're saying, like, this is someone who, now, I don't want to keep bringing up the injury history with Sweat because he's been really durable in the NFL. But if you're saying how many more seasons does he have on him, and you talk about scheme with Reddick, which I don't buy totally because I think you have to design a scheme to maximize your best players. But it's not as if Sweat's good dropping in coverage, right? So now Shield might be wrong, and you might be right that Reddick commands more. So if you're gonna trade the older player and get better draft picks back, then it would behoove you to do it. The big variable here, and we'll have a lot of time this offseason to discuss this, is their honest assessment of Nolan Smith. Because Nolan Smith was compared to Hassan Reddick coming out. Nolan Smith's not Hassan Reddick. And you could say, look, it took Hassan Reddick 4 years to become Hassan Reddick. He wasn't used the right way, but sometimes pass rushers, it might take them time to develop. But this was always the question we had about Nolan Smith was he didn't have prolific pass rush production in college, right? So what makes you think he's going to be this type of sack producer in the NFL? And we certainly didn't see it this year. That's a roundabout way of saying if you trade Hassan Reddick, then you need to have a really good plan for what you're doing as an edge rusher. And maybe that's signing Bryce Huff or Josh Uche or Andrew Van Ginkel. Maybe that is trading up in the draft for Dallas Turner, which would be really enticing for me. If you have 3 second-round picks and Dallas Turner drops to like that 10 to 12 range, you can be aggressive. Maybe you're real high on Chop Robinson or Chris Braswell or someone like that in the draft. But, man, I mean, Hassan Reddick is so talented. Like, he is elite at getting to the quarterback. That is one of the hardest skills to find, or it's one of the most valuable skills to find. I would have a hard time moving on from him unless you had a strong plan to replace him. I would say this. If someone's willing to pay him $25 million, there's a reason for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he does the thing that is most valuable on defense, and he does it as well as, like, 5 guys in the league.
We all silly like the mayor.